Hello educators. In this video I'm going to be going through some of the Zoom security features that I find to be most helpful in terms of controlling and maintaining a tight lockdown Zoom classroom where you don't have students potentially sharing your screen and sharing something inappropriate or taking over your Zoom chat, or even worse, going on mics and playing something inappropriate or saying something inappropriate. So we're going to go through in this video 6 settings or tools that I think are very helpful in securing these Zoom rooms. And then at the end, we're also going to show you how to view the records of any meetings that you hold on Zoom so you can see who was there, how long they were there, and if there were any unwanted guests in your meeting. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to authenticate meetings or make sure that your meetings are authenticated. Basically what an authenticated meeting, in our case for Boston Public Schools, it will lead to the only people who can join your room are Boston K-12 accounts or Boston Public School accounts. Now this does allow students potentially from a different school who have a Boston K-12 account to come in, but if you have this setting, you will have a nice strong record that can show you right away, oh, this student who's not even in our school was in this meeting, and then we can handle that with appropriate people afterwards. So there's 2 big things you need to do to have an authenticated meeting. The first, you need to make sure that you enable the authenticated meetings in your Zoom settings. So there are some main Zoom settings that control what your defaults are in any meeting you launch and what powers you might have or something. And then after you enable that, you also have to go into each individual meeting and tell them, hey, I want this to be an authenticated session type meeting. So for the first piece, if I want to enable authenticated meetings in my main Zoom settings, if I go to Clever, that's one great way to get into my Zoom settings. And the benefit too is if you launch through here, what we found out, thank you to 7th grade team, Miss Ogagba and everyone who helped us there, if you click through here, it actually does upgrade your Zoom account a little bit. So it's worth clicking that once if you haven't done it before. It's also a great way to just get to your Zoom page where you control all your settings. So once I clicked this Zoom launch from the staff links, it took me right here to my main Zoom page. Here I'm at your profile. We're not going to talk about that, but you can do things like change your avatar and your display name, things like that in profile. What we're going to be looking at is settings. And specifically in settings, we're looking to authenticate the meeting. And because there are lots of different settings here, and I don't want to scroll through each one, I'm going to use Command F, or my Finder here. And when I hit Command F, eventually my slow computer will pull up this Finder bar here. And if I go ahead and type in the word authenticate, or even part of the word authenticate, you see it pulls me right down to any of the settings that mention authenticate. And this here, always for any of these things, blue is the on switch, gray is the off switch, and you want to make sure for certain that only authenticated users can join meetings. This is on. Now believe it or not, this does not mean your meetings are going to be authenticated. It just gives you the option to turn that on when you create the meeting, which can be confusing at first. I would also definitely recommend checking off this down here. If students join from a web client, that means if they try to join from the web browser where it doesn't look as good, we still want to make sure they're authenticated. We don't want to encourage kids to be coming into that web client at all. So make sure these 2 switches are on. You should see for meeting authentication options, they'll show you the default, which lets in Boston Public School kids. So once I've done that, these switches automatically save. I don't need to hit a save button. And now we're going to talk about the second piece. By doing this, I've now enabled authenticated meetings to be possible, but I haven't turned it on for any of my meetings yet. The second piece, I need to make sure in any meeting where I want authentication to be required that I tell Zoom, please authenticate people. And to do that, I'm going to go back to that Zoom page. This is one way to get there. And if I look back in this main navigation panel here, I'm going to click into Meetings. Apologies for the wait as it loads up, but when it comes up, any recurring meetings that you've set up, your usual classes, should be listed here. If they're not listed there for some reason, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to troubleshoot with you. My email is ddoherty3@bostonpublicschools.org. I want to type all that, so I'll just say ddoherty3@bps.org if anything's not clear in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to need to change this. If I want this for each class, I'd have to do it for each one. I'll just show it for one. When I hover over this meeting, maybe my first period, I'm going to go ahead and click Edit to change some of the specific settings in that meeting. Here, this would allow me to change a lot of different things I want, but all we're focused on here is, again, anything about authentication. That, annoyingly, probably the most important feature, is buried in a tiny little box under Meeting Options. And you need to check this off. The default is it's not checked off. Once I check this off, only authenticated users can join Boston Public Schools. Now I'm confident once I hit save that now this meeting will actually be truly authenticated. Here it's worth pointing out while we're there, there's also a nice feature where you can pre-build breakout rooms. To be honest, I found it to be a lot of work, not worth the time, so I haven't been doing it anymore. But there's a whole bunch of videos on how to build a breakout room pre-assigned situation, but pre-warning, it's quite a bit of work. Alright, so I'd save there, I'd go and I'd do that for each one of my classes. I'm hitting cancel because it was already there and I don't want to potentially mess with anything. But you'd go set that up for each one of your meetings. It's not going to automatically filter down. So once you've done that, at that point, you now have a meeting where students need to authenticate themselves. It's one extra step. Students are going to have to click log in to join, and then they click sign in with Google. I've made a Loom video about it that I'll try to share towards the end in that document I'm showing you. Alright, next thing's up. We're going to actually go into a Zoom and look at some of the tools that are super helpful for managing the Zoom and making sure even though my meeting's authenticated now, I could still have a BPS kid come in. Who knows, they might even trick me and somehow come in under a name of one of my students. So I want to make sure that ultimately if things do go wrong, even though my meeting's authenticated and it's much less likely for that to happen now, I want tools to make sure if things go bad, I can immediately kind of pull it together. So the first one we're going to talk about is the mute all button, and Zoom has made this a little bit easier now, but the mute all button is pretty meaningless if you don't also disallow the participants' ability to unmute themselves. In short, if I hit the mute all button because two kids are arguing with each other or saying something inappropriate, they are real smart. Before I even get back to the room, they're going to have hit unmute and they're just going to keep going. At the same time, I need to make sure that normally we want kids to be able to mute and unmute themselves. We're requiring them to mute it sometimes. We can't have them asking us permission. So normally we need our default to be, hey, kids can unmute themselves, but in a panic situation, I want to be able to mute everyone and then immediately at the same time make sure nobody can unmute themselves, and now it's just me and my co-host who can talk. Here's how we do that. When I'm in a Zoom meeting, give me 1 second to get there. When I'm in a Zoom meeting, I'm a host right now. I've got one guest that's also me playing here as a student for a second here. And what I've done is I've clicked two buttons down here to bring up some important menus. Normally when you come into the Zoom, it's going to look like this. Always I want to touch chat and participants right away. They're two important menus. I need them up at all times. And in that participants menu is where almost all of my controls for this meeting really sit. Let me get this out of the way. So the first thing we're focusing on is the mute all button. And that sits right here. When you screen share, that will look in a little different spot. You're actually, when you start screen sharing, you will lose that, but there's a little menu bar, and if you touch participants after you're sharing your screen, there'll be a little pop-up window that kind of helps you do the same tools we see here. But either way, I'm looking for that mute all button within participants, whether I'm sharing my screen or not, and as soon as I click that mute all button, right down the line, it will mute everybody. Now there's something important here that Zoom added. Normally, we want our participants to be able to unmute themselves. A lot of times I might hit mute all in my class if 4 kids are talking, they're really excited after a Kahoot answer, and I just want to get back to normal. But the kids are great, they're fine, and I want them to be able to unmute themselves quickly and go back to normal. But other times it's crisis mode, a couple kids are fighting, somebody's in your Zoom who shouldn't be there, and you want to make sure that nobody can unmute themselves. This box here is very important. When I go to hit mute all in a panic situation, I'm going to go ahead and check that box off. And now when I hit mute all, I've muted everyone in the room besides me. And now they don't have the power, unless they're a co-host like my co-teacher, they do not have the power anymore to unmute themselves. Now as things calm down, we remove whoever shouldn't be in the room. Now I can go back to this more menu right here. And I can very quickly check that box off again that allows participants to unmute themselves once things are controlled, and we're in a good spot to let kids start controlling their own mute button. I hope that makes sense. We're going to keep moving now into the next one, but again, if you have questions about that tool or something looks different on your side, please email me at that same email address. The next function we're going to look at is how to control your Zoom chat. Just like kids, a little less problematic in the Zoom chat, but still a huge issue if you've got students putting in the chat, using it inappropriately. So we're going to talk about a few things with the Zoom chat. First, we're going to talk about disabling private messaging between students. I believe BPS has now made that the default, and that absolutely should be the default setting, but we'll show you where that setting is to make sure that students, we should never be allowing students to private message each other. We want to make sure they can only message the whole class, including us as teachers, or privately message us, but we got to remove that function for them to message each other privately. I'm going to show that first, and we'll talk about the two other Zoom chat things. So if we're back in that Zoom page where your meeting settings are, and we go back to settings, and we'll let that load up. And now I'm going to look at for private, something about private chat, and go, lo and behold, when I control F for private, the first thing in this giant menu that I find is the stuff about private chat. It says allow meeting participants to send a private one-to-one message to another participant. And you want to make sure that this is turned off. We don't want students to be able to send private messages to other meeting participants who are really just other students. So make sure this switches gray. I think that's the new BPS default setting that they updated across every account, but it's definitely worth double checking. Now, as we come back to the two other things about the Zoom chat, when we're in the Zoom chat, sometimes it gets crazy in that public Zoom chat. Kids don't use it appropriately. So we need to have the ability to change the chat privileges for all users. Maybe you have 3-4 students, too many going back and forth, and you just want to shut chat down for every student. And then other times there might be just one or potentially 2 students, and you think, hey, I can keep privileges for everybody else, and maybe I'll just temporarily mute or temporarily remove the chat privileges for these 2 students. What I would first do is, if I'm thinking about changing chat privileges, to know the different levels of chat privileges. So that's what we're going to look at right now. When I'm in the Zoom chat, and if this bar says everyone down here, so I hit chat to open this chat window here, and so long as this bar, so long as I'm chatting to everybody in the room, these 3 dots right here are going to change the permissions for every user in the room. The default is everyone publicly. This is allowing all of our students to message publicly to everybody where teachers see it as well. If I switch over to host only, now all the students can only message me or any of my co-teacher co-hosts. They can't message the whole room anymore. And if I really want to get extreme, if I don't even want that student private messaging me, I would personally just send that student to a waiting room or remove with them if they're private messaging the teacher inappropriately. But if you want to remove that function too, if I go to no one, now people can't even send me as the host even a private message. The other thing we mentioned is that sometimes you don't want to change the privileges for just one user, for all users. Instead, you want to just be changing the privileges for one particular student. And here's how we do that. Thank you to Ms. Donovan, who taught me how to do this. If I go switch over from to everybody, and I pick as a host, remember I can pick anyone in the room, I'm going to pick the student who's called Derek Doherty, and now I'll see privately. And when I see Derek Doherty privately, now this 3-dot menu is only going to affect that student's chat privileges. So maybe Derek Doherty just kept abusing the chat, wasn't doing it well, and other kids are doing great. I'm going to switch Derek Doherty over to host only and say, hey, we'll chat later. And just giving the kids a heads up, hey, he can only chat me now. Maybe they'll come back to me, and maybe when I have time I'll figure it out. But otherwise, now that kid can't mess up our chat anymore. And maybe we can just unturn it at any other time. Now if I pick Derek Doherty again, I can switch him over from host only back to everyone publicly if we figured it out and we trust that kid in the chat again. Again, any questions about controlling the Zoom chat, please send an email to me. I'm always happy to discuss these things. The next thing we're going to talk about is your share screen settings. I believe, again, this is something where BPS has updated the default so that only hosts can be sharing their screen. And then we're going to show you how to figure that, how to switch that one way or the other. I think that's what you definitely want for the default. But then we'll also show you this quick switch that lets you, hey, middle of class, things are going well, you know the room's secure, and you want a kid to share their presentation. How you can easily, in the middle of a meeting, now change the privilege and let students share. So the first thing, if we're trying to change our master share screen settings, again, we'll be back in our main Zoom page. Again, we're going to be in settings, and I'm going to use my Control F or my Control Find and look for share. 9 entries, it'll help me find anything related to share screen in here. And you see the second entry down here, screen sharing, allow host and participants to share their screen or content during meetings. And right now I have that switched on. You're going to want that switched on so that at least allows the host to share. And for me, my default, I believe this is what BPS default is these days, but you should double check me. It says who can share, and I think the good idea is you should have host only for sharing. I don't want all participants because at all times I kind of want my room secure, and then the rare time I do want to let students share their meeting screen, then I'm going to change that setting. Here's how we do that. So if I'm back in my Zoom, this little bar, this little up arrow right next to share screen, I have that available if I'm the host and I want to play with some of the share screen settings. If I click this button right here, advanced sharing options, it's going to bring up this tool menu, and now I can switch over from who can share, from only host, to all participants. Now when I go to all participants, and if somebody else were trying to share their screen, it's important to know, I wish I were ready to do this, I'm not. If, say, that student they're already sharing and something gets weird, I can click on them and more, and there is going to be an option to stop sharing their screen. If you have any questions about stopping students from sharing screens inappropriately, those settings, please reach out to me, but it should be pretty straightforward for how you can switch that on and off for students. Next thing we're going to talk about is the disabling rename function. I want to be fully transparent here. From what I can tell, there are ways for students to enter a Zoom meeting without their default BPS name, even if they're authenticated. We're still looking into that. But there is a way at least where you can make sure that once they come into your meeting, they should not be able to rename themselves, or at least not easily. And here's how you disable the rename function. That can be a main setting switch. And I've gone back and forth on this right now. You see if I go into main settings and I search for rename, allow participants to rename themselves. Right now my default is off. And I've been going with that and just trying to troubleshoot if students don't like their display name, trying to help them update on Zoom or SIS there to get it better. But most students, the SIS, that Zoom name is okay, and for a lot of security reasons, it's good to take away the privilege to rename, as many benefits as we could potentially see to it for students' comfort levels. Now, if I'm in a Zoom meeting, maybe I do want to change all of a sudden and let kids rename themselves. That's in this More menu right here. So if I touch Participants, Invite, Mute All, and then this More has a lot of my control settings that are important. And you'll see here there's no check mark next to allow participants to rename themselves. But maybe I trust a room, things are good, I want to let kids rename themselves to tell me for breakout room choice, right? Maybe I say breakout room 1, 2, or 3, which ones do you want? And that way kids could just rename themselves quickly and put a 1, 2, or 3 in front of themselves to help you with kind of breakout room choice situations. I'm going to uncheck that again just in case. And we're going to go into the very last feature that we mentioned in this list. The last thing is the ability to grant co-host powers. A huge thank you to Miss Ogagba and Miss Neville in 8th grade who worked with me and helped me figure out when I was crying and ready to say, how come I can't have a co-host? So thank you to those colleagues who really helped me figure this out. It turns out for some people, if you're like me and you never opened Zoom through Clever, there's a chance your account's never really been pulled in with BPS's account settings. So if for some reason you don't have the co-host function like I had, it's important, just go into Clever and open Zoom once, and it's going to sync you up with the BPS network, and that makes you sure you have the co-host privileges if for some reason they're not there. And making a co-host is actually pretty straightforward. If I want to make this guest here, Derek Doherty, a co-host, I'll click on them. I'll click Make Co-host. And now as co-host, they have a bunch of privileges. They can mute students, they can admit students, they can push them to the waiting room. The only real big privilege they're not going to have is the control of breakout rooms, because the way Zoom is built, that needs to be done by one person. So if I'm a teacher who's teaching and I want my city year or my co-teacher to be handling breakout rooms, instead of making them the co-host, I'm going to actually make them the host. And when I change host to them, you see this button right here, Reclaim Host would let me reclaim it. You should have them make you a co-host immediately so you can still mute kids while you're teaching. And now they at least will be the one. You see I kind of lost my breakout room block and a couple other things, but if I hit Reclaim Host, as the originator of the meeting, I can always reclaim the host title. Now I get my polling, breakout rooms, and a few other options back up here. Beyond that, the one thing I'm trying to figure out, and we'll figure out tomorrow, I guess, we think our co-hosts can also share when the setting is can only share by hosts. If you have info on that, feel free to email me. But we're hoping definitely that co-hosts do have the privilege to share their screen too when you set it so only hosts can share. But I don't have full info on that yet. Okay, the very last thing I want to show, and this video is super long, so sorry for that, but these features take a bit to get through. The last thing I want to talk about is I want to be able to view my meetings. Maybe for attendance purposes, I want to know who went there just to quickly have a list. I want to know if a kid was there for a bit and left, kind of only came to half my class, so I can see that record. And also, if I had any unwanted guest or anybody I was unsure about, like did they mess with their name, this lets me see who joined based on their Boston K-12 accounts. A huge shout out to the BPS OIIT people who answered me right away as I was ready to cry and couldn't figure out how do I possibly see my meeting participants. So please, the help desk people at OIIT are amazing, so feel free to reach out to them, and they've taught me a bunch over the years. So if I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change that, I need to go into My Settings. And when I'm in My Settings, I'm going to go now back to that top thing here, this navigation panel, and I'm going to look for reports. So you see profile, meetings, webinars, and at the bottom, I should have reports. And when I go into reports, I'm really looking for usage. I want to figure out ultimately who was in my meeting, how long were they in the meeting, and that data is contained in usage. So I'll click usage, and up here it's going to let me filter. We run tons of meetings, so Zoom, for good reason, the default will only show you the last couple days. You can't go back more than a month. I think they start purging records. But if you play with this, you can get to any meeting records from the last month. They'll give you information to figure out here about the stuff, like when it started, when it ended, and most importantly, how many participants were there. So I'm going to go ahead. Today was the 24th, so I want to pick a meeting from today when we were using authenticated features, so we'll go ahead with this class here. So here's my second period class. Click in. And now when I click that 39 blue link, it's going to bring up information about that meeting for me. It's going to tell me all the meeting participants who were in there, what their name was, what their Boston K-12 account was in case they were somebody who's managed to mess with that. And it'll also tell me the duration of minutes they were in there for. One thing that's helpful is to show unique users. From what I can tell, when you use breakout rooms, it'll make it look like the kid has left the meeting and come in a bunch of times, because if you use breakout rooms and sends them in and out, it kind of breaks their report time since they come in and out of the main room. So a lot of times, if I'm not trying to really dig into a student, I just check off show unique users, so I can see how many minutes each kid was in my room for, and that kind of just gives me the key info without all that extra data and duplicates. If you ever want a spreadsheet of this to be able to break it down, analyze the data more closely, you can just check off this export with meeting data button to get all the key info, and then you hit the blue export data and it opens up a spreadsheet, which is easier to play with. That was a whole ton of information, too much certainly for one video, so I'm sorry for that. So again, I want to remind everybody, if you're trying to get any help on this, if you have any questions, please reach out to me, email me. I'm ddoherty3, and that's ddoherty3, of course, at bostonpublicschools.org. I'm going to put at bps.org there. Alright, I hope that was helpful again. Thanks for watching to the end of the video, and good luck with your Zoom meetings.